Welcome to the third and final video in the Intro to Microbiology series. And in this video, we are going to talk about some ways that microbes benefit us, humans, and some ways that they harm us. So bacteria are what we're mainly going to talk about in this class. But a lot of microbes get a really bad rep. We really tend to talk about them when they harm us, right? When they make us sick. So people tend to think that all microbes are just harmful, especially bacteria. And that is not the case. So microbes do benefit us a lot. So one way is that some organisms, like fungus that we talked about in the last video, naturally produce antibiotics, which we can use to heal us if we do get infected. We can also use some microbes to make food and drink, bread, wine, beers, cheese, things like that, right? Things that are very scrumptious. And they can do that through a process of fermentation, which we'll talk about a bit more. Remember, Louis Pasteur helped discover the process of fermentation. And with fermentation, it's basically a way that some microbes make energy, make ATP. And in doing so, they release carbon dioxide, and that's actually, what helps, yeast rise to help make bread and things like that. And it also allows them to produce, there are different types of fermentation. One is called like alcohol fermentation, and they can make different types of alcohols. Another way that microbes are beneficial is that they recycle vital elements. So think back to, science classes in middle school and high school. You may have talked about the carbon cycle, the phosphate cycle, the nitrogen cycle. Right? There's all these cycles. And that's basically how things like carbon get recycled. And things like fungi and bacteria, some of them are saprophytes. Remember, that's the fancy word for decomposers. So by breaking down dead and decaying organic matter, they're putting some of those nutrients back into the earth, which can then go through their respective cycles. And so it just kind of keeps our environment nutrient rich. One of my favorite benefits is what's known as bioremediation. So if you kind of look at that term, remediation means you're trying to like fix something, right? And bio, like biology, means you're using like something living. And so bioremediation is using living things to solve a problem. So some very famous problems have been oil spills, right? When there's an oil spill in the ocean, we don't want to just dump more chemicals in there, right? The oil is already disrupting that ecosystem. And so for a long time, we were like, what do we do? How do we get this oil out? And so it turns out there are some bacteria that naturally break down oil. And when they break it down, what they break it down into does not harm that aquatic ecosystem. And so by introducing bacteria to an oil spill, eventually the bacteria will break down and eliminate that dangerous oil. So pretty cool, pretty snazzy. We also use microbes for insect control. There are certain species that can prevent pests from getting crops. So you don't need to know this specific detail that I'm about to tell you, but there's a bacteria called Bacillus thuringiensis, and it naturally produces and releases these little crystal molecules that naturally repel insects, okay? And so instead of spraying pesticides and chemicals on plants, they can introduce this bacteria that will naturally keep them away, and the bacteria doesn't hurt the people or the ecosystem. And then something I mentioned back during our first video in this series, a lot of microbes make up our normal microbiota. Those are the things that live on us and in us that actually tend to help. They help with digestion. Some of the bacterial species that live in our body actually try to prevent us from getting sick. They do something called microbial antagonism. They try to make the environment only friendly to things that naturally live in our body. So when, a pathogen comes into our body from the outside, it's not going to be compatible to that environment in our body. So our normal microbiota does also try to keep us happy and healthy. But of course, some microbes are not doing us any favors, okay? Some microbes are termed opportunistic pathogens, and you're going to hear this word a lot this semester. Opportunistic pathogens are normally parts of our normal microbiota. They live in or on our body, and normally they are just fine. They are happy and they are helping us. Make us sick. So a very common example here is a yeast infection. And so, for instance, when we take antibiotics, right, antibiotics specifically kill bacteria. So when we take an antibiotic, we kill a lot of the good bacteria in our body. And so this is going to allow other things like yeast, that's also normally in our body, to thrive because antibiotics don't harm yeast. So with all these bacteria wiped out inside of our body, these yeast are like, well, hey, check out all this space and these extra nutrients. And so they grow to higher levels than normal. This is how people can get a yeast infection. Okay, so normally the yeast are good, they're helping us. But when the opportunity arises, they can get out of hand and in turn make us sick. So that's an opportunistic pathogen. It's only a pathogen when the opportunity arises. Another way microbes can be harmful is that some microbes can cause biofilms. And biofilms are what you see in that top image. It's a mass or community of cells. And it's normally a variety of organisms. And we're going to talk a lot more about biofilms later. But it's a kind of this nice community of organisms that protect themselves by making this outer layer of what we call a hydrogel. And in the picture, you can see it. This kind of yellow, looks like it's kind of encasing them. That's a hydrogel that protects them from things like antibiotics. So organisms that are part of a biofilm are much harder to get rid of, right? Which is a problem if they're making it sick. These little communities, these little massive cells, can also clog things like catheters and heart valves, so they can become dangerous in a hospital setting. And these last two are things that you're going to be more familiar with already. Microbes can lead to food spoilage, right? Meats decompose, fruits grow fungus and things. A lot of bacteria that make us sick, they can only grow, or they have their optimal growth temperature at our body temperature, which is 37 degrees. That's why we store like leftover food in the refrigerator, because it's too cold for a lot of bacterial pathogens to grow. But there are some things like fungus that grow just fine at cooler temperatures, which is why if you leave things in there for too long, you will eventually see microbial growth. And then the last one, infectious disease. Some microbes are pathogens. They do make us sick. And so we are going to spend 2 units, Unit 4 and Unit 5, talking about different pathogens. So we're going to probably talk way more about infectious diseases than you may want to, but it's really cool and you're going to enjoy it. All right, y'all, that is the end of the intro to micro conversation. As always, let me know if you have any questions.